Now, so it's going to be really quick. What have we learned? That's what I was supposed to talk about, and that's partly today, but it's particularly the books that have been produced. Who's he? We're fed up with him. There you are. It didn't produce all that many local studies, did it? It produced quite a lot of big books, not so many local studies, but this, of course, when we come to him, we got lots. The books are very varied, and that's fun, because they're not just clones of each other. They all take a different approach. And to me, the great strength of garden history is it's organised in this country. OK, we've got the Garden Trust now, but we've all got our own bolshy garden trusts doing it our own bolshy way, and that's good. So it isn't just one copying the other. So, for example, some of them, like Patrick's one for Yorkshire, transcribe the entire texts and give all the illustrations. Some of them, like the Buckinghamshire one, are arranged more as kind of accounts of particular sites. That works very well. The Norfolk one takes a sort of more of a chronological approach, but then we wouldn't we? Because that's where he's really from, isn't it? Not from Essex, really, is he? So there he is at Susted, and there he is dead. So we had him at the beginning, we had at the end. Now, when we come to look at those illustrations, I often think with Repton we're sucked into the illustrations. We look at the maps, okay, the plans, and we look at the wonderful hand slope here, from the Buckinghamshire book, the wonderful red books. We don't always look at the texts, except for the information they give on the particular sites. But the really interesting thing is indeed the text and the way he constructs, well, this complicated stuff. I mean, I used to just flow over this sort of detailed, abstract, theoretical, well, garbage, I used to think, but it's not. I think it's very important to see what he is doing here. There's a few quotes from various people. Repton had to acknowledge a client's particular wishes, the luxury of abstract and consistent principles was denied to him. That's John Dixon Hunt's one for you, Steve. There is a sort of feeling that consistency wasn't a feature of what Repton did because he was always responding to the client. And I think up to a point that's true, but that's not what he said. What he said, quite decidedly, was he was trying to, here we go, all tending to establish fixed principles in the art of laying out ground. That's what he was trying to do. A scheme, a theoretical scheme. And he works it through using a whole load of phrases like character. And the character is one of the most interesting concepts, I think. Character sort of embraces everything, but particularly the idea that the house should be appropriate to the status of the client. Repton, a deep social conservative in many ways, but also that the ground should respond to the nature of the place and to the style of the architecture. So you can't plonk anything down for anybody anywhere. It has to be very carefully considered in terms of its social context, its geographical context, and its architectural context. So, for example, for a house like that, Barningham in Norfolk, it's perfectly okay to keep an avenue. But for a house like Tewin in Hertfordshire in 1799, when the old house was there, a load of avenues were fine. But as soon as you got something like that, no, you can't have that. So that has to turn into that. I am doing this quickly. Right. One of the interesting things about him is the range of people he's serving. Now, we can exaggerate the exalted character of Brown's clientele, but basically Brown is working for the super rich. Repton does a range of all sorts of stuff, going from really quite small villas, I mean that really is a small villa, through larger stuff to local manor houses, to whopping great stuff. But it's the range that's important, and I think we can go wrong if we start interpreting what he did too much in terms of a relatively lowly clientele. He does work for the greatest in the land as well. He works for anybody. He works for anybody who gives him any cash. I think that's basically it. There are recurrent features of his work, of course. The idea of enclosed landscape. So he does at certain places like Sheringham talk about bringing cornfields into the view, but only when they're very distant and only just glimpses. A park has a character, an enclosed farmed landscape has a character, and preferably, as here at Hanslope, the two don't meet. He's wonderful at thinking very carefully about how the landscapes work in terms of subtlety. I think that's one of the things I've really picked up from reading all those books, is not just from the texts that are being given, but the interpretations. It's the subtlety with which Repton can work on the concept of association. You see something, you interpret it in a certain way. First impressions last longer, so hence this detailed stuff about approaches. I love honing. I mean, honing, which we have in the Red Book for the book for Norfolk. The idea that the management of the high road is pretty ropey at honing because it goes off at right angles, so it looks like the public road is going on to a place of greater importance. But you can't possibly have that. You've got to leave it in a gentle curve, so it looks like the entire road network of North Norfolk is leading to the front door of Honing Hall. So it's that kind of subtlety which I think is important. And lodgers here at Armley from Patrick Ayres and Karen Lynch's book. But we've got to be careful. And again, this is something that comes through reading the books very, very clearly, that you can construct a narrative where everything Repton does is about status, about displaying status, about negotiating status. Whereas, of course, if you read Repton, what he's really about as much as anything else, it's about domesticity. It's about making nice, convenient, comfortable places where his clients can live, and crucially, where they can entertain guests who are staying and, above all, have a family life. He's intensely rooted in his family, and I think one of the things we got from doing the Norfolk book was how much he owed to that period when he lived at Susted. Playing the role of a squire, as it were. And family life comes in with things like the Children's Garden at Woburn or here at Ensley. So there's all that kind of stuff. Now, I've got 14 minutes, but it might extend to 15 minutes. Let me just say in more detail a little bit about what I, in particular, picked up. Well, one of the things that we've learnt this year is new sites, and we heard about some of them today. Normanton in particular, Litchant as well, and so and Johnny Phibbs, of course. Great Johnny Phibbs has been collating and collecting, and he's been adding dots to this map which appeared in Stephen's book some time ago. And the discovery of these places actually also gives additional useful information. This is my favourite. This is from the Hertfordshire Repton book. This is Hillfield, designed by Wyatt. And the only evidence of Repton's involvement comes in a single letter, which was unearthed by Anita Rayfield. And that letter is Teresa Villiers writing about her husband, basically pretty cross about paying the bill. He thought Repton had overcharged him. He obviously didn't think very much of Repton. And she accounts in this letter how Repton had replied in this rather fine way, that Repton obviously not pleased. If he could forget his own character as a gentleman, he could retaliate by answering Mr. Villiers' letter in the same style, but that he should content himself with saying that, however disagreeable Mr. V might think it to pay the 10 guineas, it was a much greater hardship to him to receive them accompanied by such a letter. Now, here we have Repton, as so often, constructing himself as a gentleman. And I think that's very, very important, and that comes across in quite a few of the things that came to light during the research that various people have done. And that feeds into something else. There's often a debate that surfaces about why Repton wasn't a rich man. Why didn't he end up like Brown, who really did end up well off? Brown's son's an MP, Repton's sons are settled in nice middle-class occupations like architect, clergyman and lawyer. And one of the obvious reasons is, and this again is touched on a number of occasions, is the difference in their working methods, the difference in their business. Brown runs a design and build business. He has subcontractors. He directly employs people. If you get Brown to do your landscape, you don't just get the design, you get the whole thing, the entire package. This is the complexity of his account book. Repton, of course, we've got to be careful here, doesn't just supply the design, and indeed there are occasions where he does supervise the work and he makes further visits, but he can't cream off some subcontractors in the way that Brown evidently did. But I think there's much more to it that, and I was particularly taken with the Kent book, with this quotation from Thomas Shepard. Actually, the quotation wasn't given; it was paraphrased. But I'd forgotten the quotation, so I went back and found it. And here, I think we have a wonderful explanation of why Repton made no money, from Thomas Shepard, the landscape gardener who knew him and ended up in Australia. Basically, he never kept company but with men of rank. He therefore, although naturally careful, lived up to his income. And I think Repton's concept of himself as a gentleman, which comes throughout his writings, partly feeds into that. So thank you to the Kent book for that. Well, some of the stuff we've learned isn't so much new as it's just sort of reaffirming or amplifying what we already know. And raising interesting questions. And the fun of research isn't really to answer questions, it's to raise new ones, I often think. So there's endless stuff about the picturesque and Repton's relationship with Richard Payne Nice and Vale Price, and whether Repton was himself picturesque. Well, the answer to that is quite clearly yes, he did do picturesque. So here, Bayham in Kent from the Kent book, and Musgrave in 1793, I think, Patrick, is that right? It's not that he doesn't like the picturesque. He's perfectly happy to run drives or paths to look at interesting picturesque things. He just doesn't want the picturesque in the full view of the house or as the setting for the house. That's really what all that big argument, I think, is about. But it reaffirms beautifully the examples discussed in the various books that Repton did like that kind of stuff. He's perfectly happy with that kind of stuff. Perfectly happy with it. There's some interesting stuff coming from the books about the whole business of how he gets work. Now, later on, I think it becomes more straightforward because Repton becomes very well known, and therefore people will approach him. Earlier on, there's this question of, are the clientage networks, is he working through political networks, and particularly with the Portland Whigs. And I thought Jonathan Lovey made some very interesting stuff in the Buckinghamshire book, which didn't so much undermine it, it just kind of qualified it. It's striking that the majority of Repton's Bucks clients whose political affiliations are known appear to have been closer to William Pitt than to Portland or to the overtly Tory Earl of Bridgewater. And that, of course, is right in the area of Bulstrode, where the Duke of Portland had his seat. It doesn't undermine a thing. I mean, I think there is still a very strong case to be made that Repton does work that as one of the circles. But the real problem is, I'm always saying this to the students, if you're trying to establish connections between artists and clients and things, one of the problems about the 18th century is that everyone kind of knew everybody. It's a smaller number of people. So when a student comes rushing into me and says, I've just discovered so-and-so knows so-and-so, I say, well, yeah, well, they both lived in Norfolk in the 1790s. They would have known each other. And again, Jonathan Lovey has some wonderful cases. This is, I think, great. Repton worked for William Drake at Shardlows in Buckinghamshire. This was probably as a result of the fact that he'd been employed by his brother, Charles Drake Garrard, at Lammer in Hertfordshire in 1991. But in 1781, William Drake had married Rachel, the daughter of Repton's first client, Jeremiah Ives of Catton in Norfolk. So the commission may have owed something to that connection. And it's always worth remembering that, because when we get one of those connections, we think, we solved it. And then we stop looking. And that's a good example. It's not clear where that connection comes from. Not clear at all. One of the things that surfaces through the book is something which Mick Aston, who's here, is working on, and that is Repton and architecture. And there's a very clear progression here. Repton starts off working with architects like Wilkins and like Nash and like Wyatt, both the Wyatts, but he's basically interested in the cosmetic appearance of the house in the landscape, as a feature of the landscape. But as he goes on after 1800, working with John Adey Repton, then he starts getting much more interested in architecture. He gets interested in altering, as here at Witton, in the Norfolk book, the internal arrangement of rooms, designing entire houses here. Again, another one, changing houses. This is wonderful. This is John Adey Repton's Barningham plans, the actual architect's drawings for putting those into operation. So that's an interesting development. That's one of the Yorkshire ones, Armley, I think. That the later you get, the more Repton is. In a sense, he's always interested in matching the house to the landscape. Later in his career, he can work that equation both ways. That's one way of putting it, I think. But progression is a very interesting thing, which a number of people touch on in the books. And how does Repton's style change? And you can read this in various ways, and we haven't got time to say much about it, but we can say something about pleasure grounds and gardens. There is clearly some kind of general development towards more formal, complex, architectural and varied gardens. The later you go, the more that seems to be true. So you end up with things like the Rosary at Ashridge and these incredibly complicated gardens at Ashridge, which Mick Thompson manages to write about in both the Buckinghamshire book and in the Hertfordshire book, because Ashridge, as you may know, is on the county boundary. So both of those trusts claim it as theirs. And all I can say to that is, Buckinghamshire, keep your hands off, because it's definitely a Hertfordshire site. Now, this raises interesting questions, though, this progression, okay, because we now know that Brown did pleasure grounds. There's no doubt about that. This is one of them here. This incredibly complicated pleasure ground, which he designs at Kimberley in Norfolk. So the question then becomes, does Repton start off just like Brown and get more complicated? Well, the really interesting thing is, again, this is from the Yorkshire book. Karen Lynch got this, which is a weird, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, references in a newspaper to Repton, which actually turns up in the Daily something or other for Kingston in Jamaica, right, 1790, which is itself pretty weird. But that's the one that I like. It is intended to combine the minuter beauties of gardening with the bolder features of landscape. So even at that point, there's clearly perceived to be a difference. And I thought that was a really interesting quotation. As for the speed at which he develops a more formal style, well, we've got to be a bit careful with that, because I think you can show, really, there's a lot of stuff coming in really very early. Again, from the Kent book, Cobham, wanting a broad and stately mole along a straight line of terrace. Wentworth Woodhouse, I've dared to confess I'm not so enthusiastic a discipline of waving lines and serpentine improvements as to contemn in toto every species of ancient gardening. So really, from very early on in his career, he's already talking at least about doing very, very formal stuff. And it would be great to know the only disappointment of the otherwise wonderful Buckinghamshire book, and it's nobody's fault, is that the crucial importance of Bulstrode and what Repton actually does at Bulstrode is still kind of a bit uncertain, because there are complicated gardens here. It's not clear what their development is and exactly what Repton does. But this actually brings us to one other thing, and that is this. It does seem to be true that the gardens become more architectural, formal, detailed, and complex in character. And it's also said by Repton, this we've heard Patrick talk about this before, he used this quotation indeed, of the way Repton's clients become more bourgeois. And a number of people have made the link, and it's a sensible link. They've said, well, more structured gardens make sense in small villas where you haven't got grounds to make a great big park. If your carriage drive is short, you have to rely on plants and planting and detail. And that, I must say, is an argument which is kind of convincing. The more his clients get like this, the more he gets into those kind of structured gardens. And I've believed that for a long time, and I'm not sure I believe it anymore, largely because of the work you lot have done. Because if you look at villa gardens, they don't, in most cases, tend to be formal and detailed. They're kind of really almost like Brownian ones have been. And if you look at the larger you get, Montreal here, which is pretty big and complicated. Places like Woburn, 1804, great quotations. It's not by the length or breadth of the walk that the greatness of character in garden scenery can ever be supported. It's rather by its diversity. In this part of a great place, we may venture to extract pleasure from variety. So, in a sense, you can argue the case the other way. When he's working for really big sites, really big and complicated sites, that's where you get the big, complicated and formal gardens, particularly because many of these places are being rebuilt in a Gothic style. And as Mick points out, that a lot of the things about the Ashridge garden, for example, are based on historical illusion. It's a very ancient site. It was a monastery. Hence what I think is the most macabre and bizarre of all Repton's designs, the monastic garden, the monk's garden at Ashridge, where the flower beds are made in the form of monks' graves. That'd be a jolly place to walk on a drizzly afternoon, wouldn't it? Okay, and the Holy Well, okay, as well. And similarly at Cassiobury, I think it's very, very similar. Yeah. And actually, that's another, just to reiterate something I said earlier, which again has come through this research, I think. And Johnny Phibbs, who I don't always agree with, but he has on a number of occasions made this point publicly, and I made it earlier, but I'll make it again. Repton does work for great big posh people. It's not all bourgeoisie. It's not all kind of upwardly mobile middle-class people in villas. And as Patrick said, when he's slagging off those people making new money out of the war, and many of those are effectively very big landowners, either because they've made an awful lot of money or because they were from that background and got involved in that kind of activity. So it's a complicated case. Quick one. Sarah Rutherford, Buckinghamshire. Repton is notorious for providing much advice that was never executed. Elizabeth Kens, it seems that in many cases Repton's red book lay on the library table to be looked at as a work of art or a conversation piece. And I think, of course, that's true. But I think one of the things this research has shown is you've really got to have a good think about what the red book is all about. And it really has shown on a number of the sites you lot have looked at that the red book is just one little bit of it. Sometimes they just get the red book, he goes off, gets paid, and that's it. Sometimes, though, he's back. Sometimes he's back and doing a little bit. Sometimes he's back and doing a lot, I think. And so it explains things like this. Holcombe, Norfolk, where he made this pleasure ground round the lake with the ferry. It's in the exhibition, actually. The bizarre cottage with the smoke has to rise from the window because it all looks cheerful. Doesn't look too cheerful to live in, does it? It looks like a bit of a shed, actually. But there you are, etc., etc., etc. But actually, if you go and look through the extremely good Holcombe archive, apart from the ferry boat, none of it's done. None of it's done. And yet in observations, he tells you, if you want to see how to do a pleasure ground by a lake, go and look at my work at Holcombe. And indeed, if you look at the account book, he's charging for loads of stuff at Holcombe. So basically, in that case, he makes the red book. What do you think? Not sure, have another go, do something, we'll pay you for that, is more or less how I would read that. And this just made the point, very good stuff in the auction book about how the red book is itself the result of a negotiation and conversation, but can then be the beginning of another one. Another problem, of course, is this. It's been objected to the mode in which I deliver my plans that they do not always convey instructions sufficiently clear to act as guides to the detail of execution. And they're very, very vague. I mean, other people are bound to change the ideas on the ground, like Wyatt at Ashridge, of course. And Panshanger, Kate talked about, classic example of the complexity of the Red Book. The Red Book is almost entirely devoted to where to put the house and the style of the house. That's really what it's about. Yeah, Anne Rowe's work through the accounts shows he's all over the place like a rash. He's doing all kinds of stuff that isn't even mentioned in the Red Book. That then raises questions in a Hertfordshire context. If he wasn't in a hurry, you could read all that. He does loads, okay? In a Hertfordshire context, places like Wall Hall. Wall Hall has a red book which is just about the drive. It's not about anything else. It's about the drive and the buildings next to it. Now, Kate Harwood worked on Wall Hall, and she quite rightly said, and again, I can't take you the details, there's loads of stuff in that landscape which sounds so Reptonian, it's hard to believe it isn't. So the red book isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all. The red book is just one part, in many cases, of a much, much more complicated story. And I will now perhaps come to an end pretty quick, except to say two things, then I'll stop. One is this. Several people in the books, the county books, have made the point about what a great publicist Repton was. And that's right, he's a businessman. He's not as good a businessman as Brown, he doesn't make as much money, but he is a businessman as well as everything else. The polite repository things are very interesting in this respect, and how he's using that as a form of advertising. And I was particularly taken with the Wall Hall one, because the Wall Hall polite repository illustration, the engraving is actually stuck in the Red Book as the last illustration, and referred to. So it was part of the original book. So in other words, that had been drawn and engraved, ready for publication, before the Red Book was submitted, which is really quite going it some. So he's obviously thinking about it as a major part of his stuff. The last thing I would say, just briefly, really comes on to what Kate was saying, and that is about how it's great doing the research. It's great doing the research. Research is always great. Not just the detailed stuff of finding out about particular sites, but pulling it together and see what the whole picture may mean. But the critical thing is also how we apply that in practice to preserving what is left of those sites. And the problem there, it seems to me, is twofold. And this is obvious stuff people have said before, but I'm just reminding you really. And again, I think everyone writing in those county books has said it. One is, a lot of what Repton did was very slight and very ephemeral. So if you look at that, there is really very little in that which could survive to the present. If you'd done nothing to it, you just left it and mown the grass, not much of that could survive. That's to say nothing of all the other phases of later landscaping, later styles which are going to take place. That's one. And so the best Repton gardens are in fact restored ones, like Mick's place. I always think of Ashridge as being Mick Thompson's house. Of course it isn't, is it? I bet he wishes it was. But yeah, there's not much hard landscaping like the souterrain at Gayhurst in the Buckinghamshire. There isn't that much of that. And the other problem is how much that goes back to how much was done and whether we know what Repton did. Because if we say that often the Repton book was just an indication, then he did something else, then how are we going to know how much of it was survived? I mean, in a sense, the question of preserving Repton is closely tied up with identifying what Repton did once you realise the Red Book may not be the full answer. So here, for example, we've got New Barns in Hertfordshire. And this is a great one because the plan shows quite clearly that loads of the stuff was done. That's the serpentine fish pond thing by the house, that was clearly done. The new park that he lays out on the 6-inch Shorten survey map 80 years later, that's clearly done. It's slightly different angle, but it's clearly done. So there you'd think, well, that's one. You know, that's one worth preserving. That's one worth preserving. Yeah, well, you're a bit late. It's now got a golf course on top of it, and it's just a mess. And the real problem, it seems to me, with Repton and conservation, and Kate sort of alluded to it vaguely, and that is that so many of Repton's sites are in exactly the kinds of areas which are now being threatened with large-scale chaotic development, badly planned sprawl, really, to be fair, which is not kind of being directed in any very planned and organised way, because we haven't got that kind of government. And so the fact that you've got that concentration of sites around London, partly because of villas, partly because rich people just like being around London, all that stuff's under threat. If it hasn't gone already, it's going to, because in a sense, if we think of the villas as the first wave of suburbanisation, which is really what they are, then everyone else has been bundling in the following 2 centuries. So that's the history of Repton, and understanding the generalities of his practice is partly what explains the problems of conservation. And that is the end. Thank you very much. Sorry I overrun.